Hello and welcome to another episode of the Kids Media Club podcast. I'm Andy Williams.
Hello, welcome along. I'm Jo Redfern, and today I'm delighted to say that we've got a podcast that was inspired by a request from one of our listeners. So don't forget, if you've got an idea for a future topic for our podcast, please let us know. But in the meantime, Emily, who have we got today?
It's a podcast. It's a podcast about podcasts. Sorry, I had to say it. This is the subject of kids audio is something that I have been dabbling with a little bit over the last 12 months, to the point where I kind of know exactly, well, I don't know exactly what I don't know, but I know that what I don't know is quite a lot. So, you know, when you get to that stage of learning that you think you're like, okay, I can see that the world is probably going to be pretty big. And two of my favorite people to follow and chat to on the subject of podcasts for kids are Lindsay Patterson and Carla Herbertson. So Lindsay and Carla, you're super welcome on the podcast.
Yay! Thanks for having me.
That's really, really cool. Thank you for joining us. And as I was saying before we started hitting record, this is a professional podcast, but it's not a podcast that's done by podcast professionals. So we are really feeling the pressure of making all the production run smoothly and doing it right and doing all the stuff, because you guys really know the in-depth about this. I'd throw to you both to just introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit who you are, what your background is, and the companies that you're both working in, because as I said, there's so much expertise that we're going to get to unpack in the next little while. So Lindsay, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. I'm Lindsay Patterson. I'm the CEO of Tumble Media, which is a children's audio company. And we started back in 2015 when we launched Tumble, a science podcast for kids. And that was a creative project that came out of our desire to do a children's podcast, which we'd never heard of anyone doing before. And I have two partners, Sarah Robertson-Lentz and Marshall Escamilla, and we just wanted to see if we could make something for kids. And the first question that we got often was, will kids listen to podcasts? And we realized that, number one, there was very low awareness of podcasts, and also very little research around kids' podcasts. So we really had to prove the existence of the audio medium, that kids can, in fact, be engaged with podcasts, something that doesn't have all the visual bells and whistles that, were so popular at the time and still obviously still are. So I co-founded a group called Kids Listen, which is a nonprofit organization advocating for children's podcasts, and did some of the first research into the kids and family podcast audience. And then at the same time, we were growing Tumble, the science podcast. We grew into a full-scale production company around 2020 when kids podcasts really took off. And we have also matured what we're doing in research. We're currently working on 3 government-funded research projects on different aspects of kids' podcasts and audio. And we just launched a collaboration with Ira Singerman, who's been a long-time animation industry vet, to kind of bridge the gap between kids' podcasts and the rest of the kids' media industry, to show people, how you can use the power of podcasts for your own brands and ideas.
Oh, that's so exciting. Awesome. Thank you, Lindsay. And Carla, tell us a bit about your journey.
I'm Carla. My background is in kids audio and audio throughout my career. I started at BBC working in children's radio for 10, 11 years, and then kind of continued on in the children's space, especially when apps were starting to be, it was all about the apps instead of websites, and people were forgetting about adding audio. So I started to go out on my own, then worked for various international kind of distribution companies, traveled the world, worked a lot with publishers. And then I saw just around COVID that, audio was on the rise. New companies were launching like Yoto and Tony's. And I thought with my kind of creative background and my business background, it would be a good idea to set up a children's audio consultancy and production company, which I co-founded with David Smith. We have studios in London. We work with publishers and brands globally to help devise audio strategies. We also work with new platforms coming to the market. We also produce 4 amazing award-winning podcasts for kids, which these are our passion projects. It's all about podcasts about subjects that we find disturbing within society. So we have a podcast called Bust or Trust, which is all about critical thinking and fact-checking, as well as my first podcast, which links sounds with words, which is for babies and toddlers, which is very much reply to the kind of the lack of parents reading with their children. So it's the board book of the podcast world, so to say. So that's where we are. But do you want some stats?
I was just thinking that
Do you want some
before we
stats?
get into it, and there's tons that we need to dive into. But as a scene setter, because I'd love to know, why is audio super important for kids?
Okay, so audio is important because the literacy, creativity, and independent play that happens when it comes to imagination. The National Literacy Trust does a ton of work in relation to kind of listening and how important it is. And actually, their most recent report, which we can come back to later, actually says that more kids are now listening to audio than they are reading. And amidst the literacy crisis that we're going through, this is really, really telling. The other reason why kind of parents loved audio, and especially when this kind of boom started, probably in 2020 around COVID, was the fact that it's screen-free. We can also talk about that because there's a lot of video being added to the adults side of podcasts, but it's screen-free and engaging and educational. So the kind of children's audio market is projected to grow about 28.9% by 2030. And devices like Yoto and Tony's, they're selling fast, millions sold worldwide. Fun fact is that in Germany, for example, which has a really rooted kind of audio tradition, every 2 households has a Tony's player, which is just immense if you think about it. It's the tangibility of playing with audio these devices bring to kids being in charge of what they're listening to, which if you think about the Alexa devices as such, it's hard for little children to know what they want to listen to if they don't know what it is they're looking for. Whereas if they have kind of cards or little kind of figurines, that is much easier. So I think I'd love to talk. I know this is a podcast about podcasts, but I think what I always advise kind of clients is just to look at children's audio in a whole. So it's kind of audiobooks as well as podcast. And if you wanted to do something within that area, you have to look at an audio strategy as per se, for both of those. Quick stats.
And Lindsay, as part of your research with Kids Listen, is there anything interesting that comes up with regards to developmental stages and the importance of learning how to listen? And I say that, as a parent, we've all torn our hair out and said to our kids, will you just listen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the very early things that came up and continues to be a key theme in research is co-listening and how parents and kids are listening together, and also how that changes through developmental stages. So, like, how do kids get introduced to podcasts and other kinds of audio? It's through their parents. And especially if you start young, especially if you do start with podcasts as kind of the gateway to the entire world of audio, it's going to be on a parent's device where they're like, hey, why don't you, listen to this? It's also, where are you listening with, with parents, with caregivers, with siblings? Frequently that's in the car. So there's just a huge opportunity to reach not only kids, but their parents, and engage them in the same kinds of beneficial listening habits and also conversational habits. What we hear again and again is that parents really enjoy the podcasts, not only for the listening and the learning, but the conversations that it sparks with their kids. So, we really look at podcasts holistically as a family and see the interaction that's embedded with it as a huge advantage for
Yeah,
podcasts.
makes so much sense.
And so, do you think the listening choices are being driven more by the parents than the kids for podcasts on the whole?
That really changes through child development. At the beginning, you can see a lot of like who's choosing the podcast initially, but even from an early age, once a child discovers what they like to listen to, they're kind of in the driver's seat because, as we know, like kids will ask / demand what they want. So like I have a 5-year-old, and like the minute we get into the car to go somewhere, like he's asking for his favorite podcasts. And, if we're not going to listen, I'm going to have to bargain or explain like why we can't listen. So, I would say like both the parents and the kid have a role to play. And it's really like as you start to mature, in age and kids get more independent just with the devices that they have access to, it really changes how discovery works.
But the co-listening is really interesting because as producers of podcasts, and I think you'll find as well, Lindsay, is that actually we know that we are making a podcast where parents are also listening to. And because the discoverability initially is driven by parents, because to be fair, on the podcast platforms, there is no great searches for kids, and even Spotify hasn't even got in the UK a kids and family category for podcasts.
Wow.
So,
Spotify,
which
being
is
named and shamed on the Kids Media Club
Yeah.
podcast.
That's
Yes.
crazy.
Which is crazy, and so it's very much driven by the parents. But that's why we always try and kind of incorporate, knowing that the parents are listening as well. It is quite important.
That's something that's really struck me as I've kind of like, it's so obvious when you say it, but if you're not thinking about it, it doesn't occur to you, where you're like, the physicality of audio consumption has been totally eroded by the advent of digital, right? Like back in the day, we used to have CDs, we used to have radio stations, right? Like there was different things that, you could access different choices in the physicality of it. But when it comes to today, so much of listening is it tends to be driven by your phone rather than, say, a smart TV, although I know it's possible to do on a smart TV. And I don't know, that kind of makes me quite sad because I know, like, I remember getting like audiobooks from the library and stuff when I was a kid. Like, there is such an opportunity there. And so I'm interested to hear you guys describe the kind of this potential upward inflection you're seeing since 2020, obviously driven somewhat by the pandemic and providers like Yoto Box and Tony's. Describe that a little bit more, because I think, I don't know, I think that like that sounds like something super exciting. And I think what Tony's and Yoto offer is that element of physicality and choice, which I think is helpful for kids, and the kind of that ability to give a kid a what is essentially a digital device, but you're not giving them like a phone that the whole internet is on, if you know what I mean, right?
Yeah. But the shame for me, I love the fact that these devices are out there and they take us back to that cassette player and when we used to be young and we would record songs and and record your voice, and
I used to record radio shows. Yeah,
I know. There you go, Emily.
Can't you tell?
And look at you where you are now. I know. But it's so important, isn't it? I mean, kids love, when we go into schools, kids love listening to their own voices. Kids love recording themselves and making things. And I think, it's so clever to bring that back with the Yoto and the Tonys. My sadness is a little bit around the fact that it's a middle class product. It costs money. It costs about 80, 90 pounds. And then you have to add, additional cards to it, or you have to download additional content, which I applaud them and I love it. And of course they need to make money and stuff. But I that's my biggest, not regret in a sense because I haven't done anything about it, but it is about, how can we bring, we bring audio to everybody. And I think YouTube is a real part of this kind of conversation that's, you know, which is where audio very much is for grown-ups. So, and will this open up a world as well? I mean, the platforms, any of the platforms, Apple, you know, Spotify, they're not necessarily helping kids as much. It's not their main priority to kind of, no, it's not. They don't care as much. And that's really, really, really sad. But I think what is really interesting is that more kids are listening to audio, that kids are not reading as much, which is a shame, but listening is reading. And the amazing things that will happen, you know, from that. You know, when it comes to the curriculum, there's been a real push from publishers, for example, to put audio within the classroom. Now, and Lindsay's been doing that, you know, a lot in the education sector. We've teamed up for Buster Trust with the Philosophy Foundation, creating kind of worksheets and all about critical thinking. And so that, you know, in the classroom, the teacher can get YouTube up and they can work around that. But oracy, you know, the listening and talking, is also going to be really, really pushed as part of the curriculum. So I think it's a really exciting time to be in with audio. Lindsay, do you want to say something about what you've done in education side of things? Because I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, it came from the beginning. We were getting feedback from teachers that they were using the podcast, like both for the content and for the medium in their schools. And, you know, schools have long had a tradition of like sit down and there's like a little audio station. And, you know, they've really built in an emphasis on kids listening, but obviously there needs to be more. So one of the research projects that we're working on, we're in like the third year right now. It's a 3-year grant, so getting close to the end, but it's discovering the power of podcasts to engage both blind and sighted students in science classrooms, because we're doing that because so often blind and low vision students are kind of sidelined in like such a visual, in a place where visual mediums are used to describe science. So what we're doing is both studying listening to podcasts and the creation of podcasts in the classroom, which has been a big trend in education, is having kids make podcasts in their classroom. And how can those work together to kind of deepen engagement with the subject matter? So through that, we're learning, you know, what is an ideal podcast in the classroom? Like, how do you break it into the curriculum? You know, what kinds of materials go best, because there's been so many teachers who really want to embrace podcasts, but you have to think a bit outside the box. And when you're a teacher, you've got like a lot of thinking that you need to do. So we're kind of trying to, you know, build a guide for, you know, both teachers to use it and for podcast creators to make good content within the education space. Because I think as Carla mentioned, it's like there's a real natural fit in the education space.
Yeah.
That brings us kind of on to thinking about like the different genres of podcasts for kids and what you guys are seeing that works, right? So like I think the educational space, I think it's easy enough to imagine, you know what I mean? I know there's podcasts about history, podcasts about science, that kind of thing. They're done with, you know, like as you would expect, like with the host, and that's brought it to life. What other kind of formats? I'm keeping it broad on audio, like I said, podcast. I couldn't resist myself. I had to just describe it that way. But keeping it more broadly about audio, like what other formats are you seeing that connect? What other formats do you think have potential? Like I know, like narrative and storytelling, like, you know, that kind of thing is going through. And please name any examples that you're thinking of as well.
So what we found is that, and this might be interesting actually to share, is that we've got 4 podcasts. One of our podcasts, Bullfrogs and Lizards, is a child adventure podcast, a storytelling podcast, which David, our co-founder, it's the stories his grandfather used to have on tape, and he rewrote them and kind of retold them. And they're kind of a little bit quite audiobook-esque, like, whereas our other podcasts are very much kind of podcasts around community building, etc., etc. And although from a discovery point of view, it wasn't charting on Apple and Spotify, we also release all our podcasts on Yoto, use our RSS feeds, and they ask, if they can use it, which is great. And we have a 75% growth rate on that particular storytelling podcast, which has just really found its audience. And that just says so much about when children are in charge, when that discoverability is not led by the parents, but when it's on that particular platform. And interestingly, obviously a storytelling platform where there's lots of audiobooks and lots of, it's really, really found its audience. Whereas our other podcasts, which is non-fiction, they have slightly different podcasts. They are doing okay on Yoto, but they also have quite a good following on those kind of platforms where parents are discovering the audio. So that little bit of information was just so interesting to see that actually by being where your audience is, you can have a real different impact. And so, yeah, always distribute everywhere.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that sounds like there are similar discoverability challenges as video producers have. So, Lindsay, what would you advise when you're thinking about creating a podcast, thinking ahead to that distribution discoverability strategy?
Yeah, I think one of the things to really think about is what you want your audience to be doing while they're listening to the podcast, because it's so portable. And, the key is really to fit into kids and family routines. So, story time, bedtime podcasts are extremely popular because there's sort of this like built-in time of day when you will listen. For other podcasts, it might be in the car. For other times, it might be like downtime. So it's really like putting together what you want people to be able to do and then interact with the podcast. Like, that's a big part of it. You have to think outside of the box when it comes to interaction, because podcasts, while they're a passive listening experience, are extremely interactive because kids are really imagining the story, the characters, sort of bringing everything to life in their heads. And so it takes a lot of focus, and they have to be sort of in the right space where they want to experience that. And then if you want to be able to ask questions, kind of seed activities for later, how do you build that into the design of the podcast? And you really have to think about, what your listeners are doing at that time. You want them to be making the most of that experience.
Are you seeing examples of kids actually creating their own podcasts that are becoming successful?
Yeah. There's an app called Tell Me, which is really great. I think it's TALMI, which is kind of used a lot in schools, and it's for kids wanting to make their own podcast. So that's great. We create in our podcast. It's all about community building. And it's about, our listeners are our super fans. And so we incorporate kind of feedback. So they comment on previous cases that we've done, and they let us know what they think. So that's really, really exciting. So it's so easy because all you need to do is leave a WhatsApp, message. But Lindsay,
yeah, absolutely.
And any other podcast, Lindsay?
Yeah, I think from the beginning, there's been a strong tradition of kids making podcasts together with their parents. Definitely during the pandemic, a strong trend of like, this is our family's pandemic project, but it goes back, years before that. One of our very first members of Kids Listen had done like a epic dinosaur epic with his son. I think they produced over the course of 10 years from like when he was 5 to when he was in high school. was called Aaron's World. And, it was just this huge project of an audio fiction. And when we started, there's a kid who was making a podcast at age 5 with his dad. I just saw yesterday that they've come out with an amazing science podcast episode that's like all about seed saving and climate change. Like, these are things that it's possible for kids to make. One of the things that we're doing with the education grant that I mentioned before too is we've made a fully accessible podcast builder for classrooms that is just like super simple. You can make your own podcast in like less than 5 minutes. It's super intuitive and kind of gets past all the technological hurdles that teachers may have in the classroom, kind of setting kids up to make podcasts. And also in reaction to some of the podcasts that we've done, we've gotten emails from kids saying like, I was inspired by your podcast to like make my own podcast. Some of them are just like my favorite noises. And,
Amazing.
It just gives kids such a sense of, I think, agency to just say like, I'm going to make a podcast about literally whatever. And they're so creative.
Mm.
Yeah. And authorship.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love the fact that it's almost a gateway. A lot of kids, if you ask them what they want to do, they go through the phase of wanting to be a creator. But actually, it is a gateway almost into that being a creator, isn't it? That doesn't require too much special equipment, doesn't require video editing skills. It's just you being yourself very often, and that's really really cool. So let's talk about YouTube, because I'm certainly, it makes so much sense hearing you speak about the art of listening and how audio inspires the imagination. You paint your own pictures, but YouTube obviously has announced recently that 1 billion people watch podcasts on YouTube every month. So what's the opportunity on YouTube for podcasts in your view? What are you seeing emerge?
Do you want to go first, Lindsay?
Sure. I think that the jury is still out what people even mean when they say, I listen to podcasts on YouTube. And it definitely is when it comes down to kids. We put Tumble on YouTube. We began experimenting with YouTube right at the beginning, but, within the past years, it's like clear that you do need to be on YouTube. I think as much of a discoverability thing and just total accessibility to, we know that that's where kids are, but the emphasis still has to be on it is an audio first medium. And yes, we can be on YouTube, but the emphasis should still be on telling really good stories that don't rely on the visual. Okay. So like building up an entirely new visual look for your podcast, I think is of dubious return.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I when you were talking about the storytelling aspects of podcasts, it made me think how powerful that is if you want to tell a story, because it's not that expensive. It's audio. I'm reminded of, I think, George Lucas and Spielberg, when they were talking about making Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, said that the visuals and the audio are equally important, but the audio is just way cheaper, and that you can tell a story with the audio in a way that isn't going to cost you as much as it would with video. And I suppose the danger with the YouTube thing is, the YouTube is maybe just a different experience, as you say. It's not the same as a podcast. It's kind of more a chat show in some ways.
Yeah, but it's interesting because from my background in distribution, when we were looking at stats of, and this is in relation to audiobook, this is about kind of 5 years ago, when we were looking at stats of where people were listening. People were listening to audiobooks, and these are 10-hour audiobooks. So this is not kids, but these are 10-hour audiobooks. They were listening on YouTube.
Right,
and with not many visuals there. And also these audiobooks shouldn't have been on YouTube. There is a piracy issue, a massive piracy issue going on there. But it's so interesting that actually people are looking, where they are looking for that content. So this is the whole thing about having to be where everyone else is. And I think that's really important when it comes to podcasting as well, and when it comes to kids. The trouble is, like, I agree with Lindsay, we are audio first. We have books coming out of, of our podcast, which is amazing. And we're very, very lucky to have publishing partners. But I think it's that kind of, so where do we go if we're on YouTube? What do we do within that space? And we've got, and interestingly, our kind of podcast, which is for babies and toddlers, that's what I spoke to Emily about this a while back, is kind of gaining some kind of traction on really teeny tiny. We hardly do anything on YouTube. It's gaining some traction on YouTube, and it's parents looking for certain words, bus, stuff, all of these things. And then those, because it's all about linking sounds and words, that's coming up. So I think it's really important to be there. It's how you decide to be there and how much time and effort you need to kind of spend as well on kind of nurturing these channels. And for us, podcasts are not necessarily making that much money, and I wish they were. And we would put a ton of kind of budget behind kind of optimizing YouTube, optimizing the social side, or all of that. But ultimately, it's always audio first for us. That might not be for other people, other brands who have a different North Star, who have a different objective, what they are doing with their audio. I don't know if you know Maddie and Tricks on CBeebies, that started out with RTE as an audio project. And so, but they always were going to animation with that. So, so it's what it is that you're objectively, what your goal is, and when you are making a podcast. So I'd love to be more on YouTube and do more there.
But the thing I would say as well, like, and Andy, your point about George, what George was saying, we're obviously on first name basis with him, about the cost implication. But the one thing I will say is that, the audience will tolerate substandard video way more than they'll tolerate substandard audio, right? Quality audio has that, it has such value in that sense. And I do this again, Carla, we were chatting about this back at the time, back when we were speaking about, the opportunity that YouTube offers in terms of routine driven moments, eyes optional. It's basically a distribution platform. It's not really, it is essentially just a distribution platform. It's not trying to be anything in particular, but people are turning to it for things like, is it, music or content to have on that they don't have to be watching, so intently. You know what I mean?
In the background.
In the background, or not just in the background. It can be more functional than that. Definitely, it's not that they're not listening. It's just that they're able to kind of move on. Whether it's the radio behavior that people are looking for, or I know Joe, you always mentioned about the study videos, which I've
Lo-fi girl. Lo-fi girl.
Yeah.
I've been spent many an hours with Lo-fi girl, which people tend to put on when they're studying, but it's just it takes you down a level, which is something that I've used it for. But I agree to your point. I think you've got to show up where people are, and if that includes YouTube, then you've got to be on YouTube. But there's something really nice, and that was why I like Lo-fi girl, because even if I did end up staring at the screen, there's so minimal visual activity happening. It's something that is very, very similar to me to kind of listening and going for a walk.
Interestingly, Spotify though is very much moving to the video podcasting. They want your pitches. If you want to pitch, it's got to be video, because that's what they really are so keen to keep everyone within their ecosystem. With audiobooks now, their music, and podcasting, and they really see the rise in podcasting on YouTube, and they just want to keep everyone within their ecosystem. And so video podcasting for them is number one, really, really important.
But it feels
whereas
like
for kids, that's again, they don't care about kids and families. They would have a category. The fact that they it just pains me.
It goes deep with Spotify. But I had to take my 11-year-old off his Spotify account because he was watching video on it. So it's like these platforms are not really built for kids and family in mind. And I think that's why it's so important to kind of build the space that we want to see while figuring out, to be expansive with discoverability and distribution. It's so easy to put out a podcast, like click a button, you will go onto all of the major podcatchers. Like there's no difficulty about it. But when it comes to really figuring out how to get where kids are, especially if you already have, your feet in a lot of different other kinds of digital spaces, like how do you bring that all together into a cohesive strategy and say, this is why you should listen to our podcast, and like this is where you should listen to it, and just kind of think of everything to get tied together.
Because I see that the kind of rise with YouTube and podcasting seems to me to be at least somewhat driven by the discoverability question, and how that's so solved for with the shorts TikTok format, right? Like that, it's those podcast moments that are able to go viral, that get the name of a podcast out there, whether it's Diary of a CEO always seems to be, I don't know why it hits my FYP, but it does, like, or, some other
3 hours of it.
Who's
3
got
hour
that time,
episodes.
man? Like,
I don't
that's why
know.
I
I know.
But that it does elevate that discoverability piece, right? Even if it's eyes optional video, like it's still the virality of that TikTok nature of consuming content is something that's a real opportunity, and it feels like that's where Spotify is going with this, rather than really thinking that they're going to be, I don't know, having like a vodcasting thing. Like it's not a thing.
Yeah. And there's only so much screen you can consume in a day, I think.
Yeah.
I think that's what I always say. When it comes to brands, if they want to, if they're thinking about audio, we just kind of say, and they're already on the Netflixes, all of the platforms when it comes to animation video, I always kind of think there's only so much media or screen young kids can consume, and I think, I think audio has a real place in that.
Yeah,
totally. Otherwise, everything becomes the same. It's everything kind of just loses all its distinctiveness, really.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
The beauty of it is you can take things, if you are a brand, you can take things into different directions so much easily, so less cost, like you were saying, Andy, and really go wild with your imagination of where you wanted to do something with it that you couldn't have done in that kind of animation setting or a strict kind of budget. So there is so much creativity that an expansion that you could have if you already have an audience and you want to kind of give them more from a kind of marketing and brand reach perspective that you could do with audio in that space, which is just magic,
and in a way the lack of visuals means that it, in some respects, is more interactive, because you're asking 100%. The audience to supply their imagination and their pictures as well, so that the fact that it lacks video is almost part of it's strength, because you're inviting the listener to occupy that space that you're not filling with pictures.
It's just essential to sort of like keep your eye on why audio, why podcast, because if you start kind of thinking about, well, this is very popular and this is very popular, we still have to have like the core proposition of audio is that it's a screen-free alternative. That is really what parents are looking for. And it's also the portability and, like Andy, you said, the imagination and creativity that you're able to bring to it. And so for creators looking to get into podcasts, it really should be thought of as a sandbox to be able to try things that you aren't able to try in animation. It is just so cost effective. Like when we were creating a budget for a potential client, like looking at their YouTube budget, it's like a third of the cost of a very reasonably priced YouTube project. So, and in that you can go to many different environments and have many different ideas. It can really be a launching pad to try out new things that have been perhaps limited by the, restrictions of other mediums. So there's a lot of creativity that you can play around with at a really reasonable cost.
And in terms of those genres, so we've talked about narrative and storytelling, particularly for the younger ones, and the educational side of things, the history and the science podcast. As professionals working in the space, where do you see it going? What's exciting? Where would you go and venture?
Oh, so many places. I mean, there's just still a lot of white space when it comes to, being in the podcast world. Like we mentioned earlier, education is huge, but yet there are not popular podcasts in every single subject that you could go to. There's also, just the ability to make different kinds of interactive podcasts, like make them for different types of audiences. A lot of what we're doing in another research project is making culturally relevant podcasts for US Latina audiences. We've been working on bilingual podcasts for a long time. So I think, there's just looking around at different audiences, different needs, different interests. Like even within the Edison survey that we did, in the top podcast category people want to listen to, or kids want to listen to, is games. And there are not a lot of game podcasts out there, which is crazy, a huge opportunity.
I'm interested to know where you see AI coming into this, because Jo Redfern sent me a kind of horrifying thing one day where she crunched one of my articles through this AI generator, and I had two American people reading back my article to me like it was a podcast.
Was Google Notebook.
Oh, it was a Google Notebook. It was unnerving, whatever it was. And like, listen, right, like efficiency in production is good, but I would be like, particularly with podcasts, right, like you're in somebody's ear. There's such an intimacy to it that I find. I don't know. What are you guys seeing on that one?
There's a lot of talk, especially also in the audiobook world, because obviously we're with narrators and voice artists, about AI, about synthesized voice. The thing is, it is out there and it will be used. And I think, I used to work for the Royal National Institute for Blind People. I managed to service their newsagent servers. A lot of the content was read by volunteers. We then went to synthesized voice, and we thought, oh my God, there's going to be a massive backlash. People won't like it. We had hardly any complaints. And the reason for that was because this audience, the blind and partially sighted audience, was already used to hearing that kind of AI voice through the software they were with. And I think, and I don't like this, but I think the same thing will happen in 6 to 10 years time, or even quicker maybe, with our younger audiences, because they already are on TikTok, they already are on YouTube. When you constantly hear AI voices, that the voices going over it, they are used to hearing that type of voice. And we, as kind of an older audience, have brought up with that, the intonation, all of that. And I think that still will have a place, but I also think realistically that they won't hear that massive change that we are hearing. You were horrified and shocked. There's an amazing kind of software out there, though, that can read a good fiction book. I don't think it's for kids yet, but it is moving really into that direction. And I do not want to lose that natural kind of storytelling aspect of you and me, telling that kind of that intimacy. But at the same time, if you're looking at what kids are consuming, then they are used to hearing that.
Yeah,
and I think
it doesn't feel jarring for them.
It doesn't. That is that's not what I want it to be. But I also think we have to be realistic. I will not be making AI podcasts.
I think another aspect of it too is AI interaction with some of the platforms that we've been talking about, especially Tony's and Yodo, sort of already experimenting with choose your own adventure, storytelling. Yeah. And I think, time will tell how kids like this. But there's different ways that AI can be used to kind of like co-create a story with kids. And, you know, is there sort of a place for everything? Like, I hope so.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's absolutely, I can totally see the potential for AI to really work in that interactive, choose your own adventure element to it. I wonder whether AI, for if it's used kind of for lots of podcasts, you're just going to get potentially a glut of content. And I think maybe people will start to be attuned to the stuff that just feels like it's being produced by AI quite quickly and cheaply.
And I needed an Irish accent on that one, Joe. Show me the data. Let me tell you about this streaming data for kids, right?
Apparently the different accents are coming. They're imminent. But I mean, it's interesting because I've used that in a very practical sense, in that, you know, if somebody has sent me a 48-page PDF report and it's been sat on my desktop for ages because I've not quite got round to sitting and reading it and digesting it yet, then I uploaded it to that and it was distilled. Now, then I went back and fact checked because, of course, we have the issue of hallucinations. But it created a 15-minute podcast from a 48-page report that the odds are I would not got around to reading. And I listened to the key takeaways while putting on my makeup. So in that sense, the audio was great for me because it did fit into my life. I was putting on my makeup. I was able to absorb some information that previously I probably wouldn't have gotten around to reading. But so in that sense, there was that kind of, the AI audio experience actually worked for me in that particular moment.
Yeah.
So in terms of then the monetization piece, because I know you touched on this originally and you said it's tough, right? Like, so I'd like, it'd just be like, can you unpack that a little bit more? Because I get a feeling that a lot of people tuning into this won't kind of have an understanding of what the distribution footprint looks like with audio. Like, you're talking, you know, publishing out to various platforms, I don't know, advertising, sponsorship, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, there's a couple of ways that you can kind of monetize your content. It's through subscriptions and Patreon, Apple, and really kind of building up that community, and especially when you have that kind of community building podcast, if that's what you want to do, and you've already have a brand with a huge following, that might be a very kind of good way to go. And then you also have advertising. But we were actually told this week by, I won't name the hosting platform, but that there's not enough money in the family and children's space when it comes to advertising, and it's far too difficult to look for sponsors and advertisers. So they weren't interested anymore. Whereas our podcasts are growing like month on month, like our growth rate is enormous. So it's very tough. And it's finding those kind of hosting partners. We're kind of talking to some in the US, kind of trying to find our own, but yeah, it's, you know, it's tough. It's not easy. So think twice. I think it really is. It really is important when you start. I think when you want to start a podcast, don't start a podcast for just wanting to start a podcast. What is the actual aim of what do you want to do? How do you want to serve your audience? How are you going to serve your audience? What do you want to make out of it? What is the purpose of it? Because I think that's the key to making a successful podcast. Because you can have a successful podcast and not make any money out of it. But if you have a massive reach and you're really serving an audience that keeps you, engaged with that brand, then you have got a successful podcast. But when it comes to monetization, it's not easy. Lindsay, you found better ways.
It's not sort of a built-in, like, let's turn advertising on type situation. I think that podcasts, like you said, it's really about what are your goals with this. So I think if you're getting into podcasts, thinking about, the creative aspect of it, and, especially for brands and companies to build affinity and awareness and sort of take advantage of everything that the podcast medium can offer. You can, be more experimental. You can deepen, the storytelling around your characters and sort of build new worlds. So I think that it should really be considered as part of content strategy, not so much for like, how much money are we going to make off of this? Because that is, I mean, there are definitely ways that you can make money off of it. I think in terms of like what Carla said at the very beginning, it's not just a podcast that is tied forever to a free RSS feed. It can, be licensed. It can be used on different platforms. It can serve as the IP for other kinds of developments. There's like lots of things, and I have seen it over and over again in my 10 years in the podcasting space. It's people using the podcast as a launch pad into their goals outside of the podcast. So I think that it's definitely a worthwhile thing to look into, but like, is it because you're going to make tons of money on it? Like, no.
Yeah, that's very much in some ways. That's the Maddie and Triggs route, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You can
100%.
produce something cheaply and quickly and of high quality as a podcast in a way that if you're going to
see if the audience is there and test it,
absolutely.
test it.
Yes. And it's just like when they went to animation, it's like all of the stories, all of the sound was already done. It's just being really creative with, the production pipeline.
Yeah, proof of concept and proof of audience, which I think is really cool.
Yeah.
That's made me want to go and make a podcast now.
Yeah.
Another thing on my to-do list. A new creative podcast.
You just did.
Exactly. I mean, I think it's just like the barriers to entry are very low, and it just allows you as a creator to kind of take your destiny into your own hands. Like, you're not needing to fundraise, hundreds of thousands of dollars before you can, put out the initial proof of concept. Like, it's just very easy to get started. And, it's a real thing that not only goes to, I want to take this, to a production company to see if they want to make a TV show out of it. It actually goes to an audience. It's accessible. And I think that that's really meaningful for creators when you can like be banging your head against the wall, just like trying to get something made, to know that, yes, you can make that thing. That's how we started. And, just wanting to make a thing and put it out in the world and see if it works as an experiment. And it may work in ways that you didn't anticipate. Like, you can't really write the course of like, where's this podcast going to go? It may take you to places you don't expect.
The beauty of it is as well, you can change things, with my first podcast, we really listened to the audience, and things weren't as clear and working as I had set out in the beginning when I had thought about the concept. And so we just changed it. We just kind of, you rewrite the script and you just kind of change it. And there's no massive kind of halfway through. You can't do that with a series, when you're halfway through, when you're broadcasting a series and it's not really working. You can't just go like, oh, well, we'll go and make those 5 episodes, rewrite them and kind of do it slightly differently. We just kind of change little things here and there, and we're able to kind of respond to really, really quickly and create a better product. And I think that's so interesting, especially when you think about that launch pad kind of. But you also must say that it's hard finding your audience. It takes a while to find your audience. So don't expect to start a podcast and then have thousands of listeners straight away. It takes time to build that up. But once you've found a couple, they will tell, and it's kind of word of mouth. None of our podcasts have had any kind of marketing budget behind them, and they've all found their audiences. And that's pretty magic, really. Well, not magic. It's the beauty of the community, and it's the beauty of the listeners, and says something hopefully about when you create a good quality product, that people will come back and they want to share and they let other people know about it. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is like it's always, once you've made the thing, it's always out there. Like you're always discovering new listeners, and if it can hit the right platform. Like we made a yoga podcast for kids that's like guided yoga practice, and it didn't do very well on iTunes. Sorry, Apple Podcast. My gosh, it's been so
I've
long.
seen.
But on Yodo, it's like, well, people who are listening to Yodo are, have the space to like be in their rooms and do the yoga movement. So it's really like you can always find new audience. But my biggest advice is to design your podcast for sustainability. Don't just like use your whole budget to be like, we're going to make 6 episodes and then see if we can like keep making more. It's like, make the podcast that's like you can really do within your budget to the best of your ability. And there's lots of ways to make it very engaging for kids that aren't necessarily like adding all of the bells and whistles to it, but to really like make it go far so that kids are going to listen again and again. Families are going to discover it again and again.
Great advice.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Fantastic.
All right, well, listen, I think, guys, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your generosity and in talking about this, because I know it's something you both live and breathe. And it's something we've been talking about getting on for a little while, and we've kind of had, the requests are coming in, so there is a definite interest in the space.
Yeah, really insightful. Thank you.
Fantastic.
No worries. No worries.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much for everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode about podcasting about podcasts. How very meta. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.